Hello everyone, this is Kevin Cofield with Cofield Aviations. In this video, we're going to discuss performance and limitations part 1. Now this comes straight out of the Airmen Certification Standards for the private pilot certificate, so the ACS private pilot. And the performance and limitations falls in that pre-flight preparation item of the ACS. So basically it's going to be your oral exam portion of your flight test. Now, where performance and limitations falls in the PAVE checklist, remember, we're going to talk of the PAVE checklist on every video. That's the basis of aeronautical decision making and risk management. So P stands for pilot, A stands for airplane, V stands for environment, and E stands for external pressure. So performance and limitations falls in that airplane category, along with operation of systems as well as airworthiness requirements. So in this video, we're in part 1, we're going to discuss the 5 types of altitudes along with also the 4 types of airspeeds and V speeds. Okay, so that's what part 1 is going to be all about. We'll dig into that into detail starting now. So I am on the CofieldAviation.com website. And what I'm going to do is basically go right here to the student section. Man, I can't point it off. I'm going to go here to the student section. We're going to go to downloads. And then we're going to go here to performance and limitations. So these are printable PDF files that you can print off, access anytime if you want to print them off, make binders, print it off, make notes, as I go through these videos, however you want to utilize these PDF files there. So performance and limitations. So let's go ahead and get started with really the big thing that I think that matters here is when it comes to performance is, does the air get thicker or does the air get thinner? Okay, so everything we're going to talk about in this video is we're going to start from the basis of does it make the air get thicker or does the air make the air get thinner? Okay, so the basis of performance is the airplane will perform better when the air is thicker than it will when it is thinner. Now, what on the airplane is affected by this thick or thin air? Okay, so basically there's 3 things that is affected. So one is the engine. Now, the engine is only going to be affected if you have a normally aspirated engine. So in operation of systems, we discuss for our flight school, we have a Cessna 172 Mike model. So it is a normally aspirated engine, meaning that it's breathing the air that it's breathing outside. So as we go up in altitude, then the pressure becomes less and less. So as we go up in altitude, then the engine performance actually decreases with a normally aspirated engine. However, if you have a turbocharged engine, then it actually is using exhaust gas to spin a turbine that increases the air pressure higher than the outside pressure, and it will basically keep either sea level pressure. If you have a turbo normalized engine, it'll keep sea level pressure, which we're going to talk here in just a minute about what the standard pressure is here. But if you have a turbocharged engine, turbo normalized, it's going to keep sea level pressure 299 or 2 all the way up to whatever altitude. For a standpoint of like a Cirrus SR22T, a turbo Cirrus, it'll keep 36 inches of manifold pressure all the way up to 18,000 feet. So in a situation like that, the engine is not affected because it's not breathing the outside air. But we're doing this video based upon the flight school airplane, which is Cessna 172 Mike, normally aspirated. So the engine is affected because it's just breathing the air that it's breathing. And as we go up in altitude, the air gets thinner and thinner and thinner because it's less pressure. Okay, so one is the engine is affected as we go up in altitude, it gets less performance. 2 would be the propeller. So regardless if you have a turbocharged engine or not, the prop is going to be affected in the fact that, again, as we go up in altitude, then the air gets thinner. So the prop is literally just taking the bite of air and forcing it aft, right, then that's what creates thrust. So when you have thinner air, you have less air to take a bite out of to create thrust. Okay, so as we go up in altitude, then your thrust is affected because the propeller efficiency is affected. And then last is lift. So as we go up in altitude, again, the air gets thinner, and so that thinner air will create less lift over the wing. So the three things that are affected by if the air gets thicker or thinner is the engine, normally aspirated, the prop, and lift over the wings. Okay, so when it comes to performance, the two things that affect performance are pressure and temperature. Okay, so these are the two things that affect performance. Now, I can say that there is technically a third thing that would affect performance, and that would be humidity. In the fact that the higher humidity that you have, which is just water vapor in the air, the higher humidity you have, actually the lighter that air is, because H2O, 2 parts hydrogen, right? So, on the same day with 0% humidity, which is completely dry, to a day where it's 100% humidity, where the air is completely saturated, that saturated air is actually going to be lighter, and so it would actually make the air thinner. Now, the reason why I don't include it in here is because the performance charts don't factor in humidity, okay? But I do want you to understand that it is a factor, and it would, on a day where it's 100% humidity, the air would be thinner, meaning you would have less performance over a day where it's completely dry. But again, our performance charts, I guess it doesn't make as much of a difference. So our performance charts in our AFM, our flight manual, or POH only account for pressure and temperature. Okay, so since these are the only two things that affect the performance, so we're going to talk about pressure and temperature. We're going to talk about how it can make the air thicker or thinner. Okay, so we're going to start here with pressure, and that's where we're going to talk about something called pressure altitude. So the definition of pressure altitude is the altitude corrected for non-standard pressure. So we have to have a standard for not only the pressure, but also the temperature. Okay, so our standard pressure is 2 niter niter 2, and that is at sea level. And our standard temperature is 15 degrees Celsius, and that is also at sea level. Now, we'll talk temperature when we get to the next altitude, density altitude, but we're just going to talk pressure altitude first. So our standard pressure is 2 niter niter 2 at sea level, and that decreases with altitude. It's about 1 inch per it's about 1 inch per thousand feet, but what we're concerned about is just the 2 niter niter 2. So that's our standard pressure. Now, when the pressure is higher than 2 niter niter 2, so for this example, we're going to say the pressure is 3012, okay? And again, you're getting this pressure on your, whether it's an AWOS or an ASOS or ATIS or whatever, you can get what the current pressure is. But when the pressure is higher than that, okay, what we ask ourselves, and everything that we're doing here is, does the air get thicker or does the air get thinner? Right? And so again, the basis of this is if the air gets thicker, then that means performance will increase, okay? And then altitude will decrease. Well, what do I mean by altitude will decrease? Okay, so the airplane will perform better. Let's just think about Miami, right? Miami is down here at sea level, okay? So you have the complete weight of the air. You're at the bottom of the pool, if you will. You have the complete weight of all that air above you at sea level, okay? So the air is a lot thicker in Miami than, let's conversely go up to Denver, the mile high city, right? So 5,280 feet, it's around 5,000 feet elevation. So as we go up in altitude, then the air gets thinner. So the air is thinner in Denver than it is in Miami. So what that means is that as the air gets thinner, our performance is going to decrease, our altitude is going to increase. So they have an inverse relationship. So when we're talking about altitude here, we're talking about basically performance. So we want to get closer to Miami, right? So as altitude decreases, then our performance is going to increase, right? We want, if our altitude is increasing, then the performance will also decrease because we're going up in altitude. So when I say altitude, I want you to think performance, okay? And I want you to think altitude equals where the airplane thinks it is at, okay? We're going to base this upon the airport elevation of Gadsden, which is Kilo Golf Alpha Delta. It's 569 feet airport elevation. But the airplane's only going to think it's at 569 feet as far as performance-wise with standard pressure and standard temperature, which is hardly ever the case, right? So the two things that affect performance, pressure and temperature, we're going to break that down and we're going to determine where the airplane thinks it is at, okay? So even though it's sitting physically 569 feet above above sea level, because differences in pressure and differences in temperature, the airplane's not going to think it's at 569 feet, okay? And that's what we're coming up with pressure altitude and density altitude. So pressure altitude is fairly easy to do the math, okay? So what we're going to look right here is 3012 is a higher altimeter setting from 299 or 2. So what that means is that's high pressure. So with high pressure, what we're doing, think about this. Does the air get thicker? Does the air get thinner? That's the basis that we're trying to discover, right? And so with higher pressure, think about if you're pushing, higher pressure, pushing those molecules together, then you get thicker air, right? So higher pressure equals molecules of air closer together, which equals thicker air. So the air gets thicker, so that means performance increases, right? So we get better engine performance, we get better prop performance, we get better lift. So performance increases, which means altitude decreases. Altitude, we're going closer to Miami. That's a good thing, right? So in this example, 3012, if you see here, this increases performance because of the denser air, and this decreases pressure altitude. Now, it's a simple math problem, all right? So any change in pressure, so this would be 1/10, would equal 100 feet. 0.01 would be 1/100ths, and that would equal 10 feet. But in this example, 0.1 will equal 100 feet. So right here, 3012 minus 299 or 2. Notice I did easy math on this because I'm terrible at math. But that's 0.2, all right? So that's a 200-foot difference, all right? So 200-foot difference of altitude. So are we going to add or subtract the altitude? Now, remember, does the air get thicker or thinner? Higher pressure means the air gets thicker. So performance increases, altitude decreases. So we would actually subtract 200 feet from our altitude. So a pressure of 3012 would account for a pressure altitude drop at 200 feet, meaning we're going closer to Miami. We're getting better performance, right? We're not going towards Denver where it's worse performance. We're going towards Miami where it's better performance. So in this example, 569 feet is the airport elevation. Pressure altitude is 369 feet with an altimeter of 3012. Okay, so just taking into account pressure, now we haven't taken into account temperature yet. That's what density altitude does. But just taking into pressure altitude, we've made the airplane think it's at 369 feet, even though it's physically at 569 feet. Okay, conversely, if we had a lower pressure, so if the pressure was 2972, that's lower than 299 or 2, then low pressure means that it's thinner air, right? So low pressure, you're not pressuring those molecules together, so low pressure equals thinner air. So thinner air means less performance and higher altitude, meaning we're going closer to Denver, right? So in this example, 299 or 2 minus 2972 is again 200 feet. So what are we going to do? We're going to add that because we're increasing our pressure altitude, which means we're decreasing performance. We're getting closer to Denver. So in this example right here, a pressure of 2972 would account for a pressure altitude rise of 200 feet. And again, when pressure is lower, this decreases performance because of the less dense air, and it increases pressure altitude. Again, performance and altitude have that inverse relationship. As altitude increases, performance decreases, and vice versa, which is what I'm going to say over and over and over and over in this video. So it would account for a pressure altitude rise of 200 feet. So for example, at Gadsden, now the airplane doesn't think it's at 569 feet, which is the physical elevation of the airport above sea level. With an altimeter setting of 2972, now the airplane thinks it is at 769 feet. Okay, all right. So, again, altitude equals where the airplane thinks it is at. And it's going to perform like it's at 769 feet. Now, that's only taken into account pressure. Again, we'll take into account temperature with density altitude. But you can also determine what pressure altitude is physically in the airplane by just setting the altimeter to 2992 in the altitude. Setting it at 2992 in the airplane, what you read will then be pressure altitude. But of course you can sit here and do this math as well. Okay, so the key here is, I would say the highest pressure I've ever seen is like 3060. The lowest pressure I've ever seen is like 2930 or something like that. So, at a 3060, I mean, that's what, a difference of, 680 feet, something like that, right? So a 3060 pressure would be high pressure, right? So the air gets thicker. So that means better performance, lower altitude. So if it was like 3060, then, what was that, 680 feet? Then that would mean that the airplane would think it's actually below sea level at Gadsden, 569 feet minus 680. But that's in an extreme case. Most of the time, pressure altitude is not going to differ more than 200 to 300 feet. So pressure altitude doesn't really affect performance all that much, because are you going to really notice a difference in performance of the airplane when it thinks it's at 800 feet compared to 569 feet? It's like, no. Like, obviously the airplane is going to perform a little less at 800 feet than it is at 569 feet, but it's going to be very minimal. You're not going to notice a big difference. Where the big difference comes into play is when we take into account temperature. Okay, and we're going to talk about that with density altitude. All right, but pressure altitude is altitude corrected for non-standard pressure. The standard pressure is 2992. So simply put, the two things that affect performance here is pressure and temperature. So pressure is 2992 standard. If it's higher than that, then that means it's thicker air, which means performance increases, altitude decreases, okay? If it's lower pressure than 2992, then that means the air gets thinner, which means performance will decrease, altitude increases going towards Denver. So now let's talk about temperature. So now we've corrected for pressure with pressure altitude. And if you notice, it's not more than 200 or 300 feet difference. Now let's correct for the second thing that affects performance, which is temperature. And then we will come up with where the airplane thinks it's at. And when we correct for temperature, that is called density altitude, which is your most important piece of the puzzle. Is density altitude. It's the most important of the 5 types of altitude. So we've talked about pressure altitude. Now we're going to talk about density altitude. So density altitude is pressure altitude. So pressure altitude is corrected for non-standard pressure, right? So it's that corrected pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. So now we're going to talk about what is standard temperature. So standard temperature is 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. Now, as we go up in altitude, we have a standard lapse rate, okay, when it pertains to the standard temperature. That standard lapse rate is 2 degrees Celsius per 1,000 feet. Now, rarely is the actual atmosphere a standard lapse rate. Usually you're going to have temperature inversions, you're going to have all sorts of different temperatures, but for a standard, we have to start somewhere. So we have a standard lapse rate of 2 degrees Celsius per 1,000 feet. So what does that mean? At sea level, it's 15 degrees Celsius. At 1,000 feet, it's 13 degrees Celsius. At 2,000 feet, it's 11 degrees Celsius. At 3,000 feet, it's 9 degrees Celsius, and you get the drift, right? So for Gadsden, again, we're doing this example off of Gadsden, 569 feet. So the standard temperature at Gadsden, because it's 569 feet, is basically 14 degrees Celsius, okay? So we're gonna factor this in based upon 14 degrees Celsius is the standard temperature. So if the temperature at Gadsden is higher than 14 degrees Celsius, okay, what does that mean? Does the air get thicker or thinner? So think about when it's nice and hot, right? You don't want to be next to your significant other, or, if you're hanging out by the, pool and it's 90 degrees, like you don't want to be cuddled up, right? So when it gets hot, those molecules expand. So you want to get further away from each other, right? So if those molecules expand, then we make the air thinner. So here we go. Did we make the air thicker or thinner? So if we make the air thinner, then that means performance decreases, altitude increases, meaning we're going closer to Denver, right? So right there, as temperature increases, the air becomes less dense, and thus performance decreases, all right? Temps above 15 degrees Celsius, this would be at sea level. Temps above 14 degrees Celsius at Gadsden, because standard at Gadsden would at 569 feet would be 14, causes increase in density altitude. Remember, the altitude and performance have that inverse relationship, and the altitude is where the airplane thinks it's at. So it's not simple math. You remember pressure altitude, 1/10 equaled 100 feet, 1/100th equals 10 feet. So it was easy math to kind of figure out pressure altitude. That's not really the case with density altitude, okay? So we have this density altitude chart that we can easily then determine what our density altitude is. So if you look here, this is our pressure altitude. So these lines go in this direction are all pressure altitude. Now, we just talked about how we found pressure altitude, right? And then let me kind of zoom in on this. I'll kind of zoom in here on the bottom there. Hey, all the way down here, this is your temperature. Okay, so remember, density altitude is pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. Here are our pressure altitude lines, so that's sea level, pressure altitude, 1,000 feet pressure altitude, 2,000 feet pressure altitude. So let's just do an example of the pressure is 3020. So if you see over here in the side, 3020 means you would subtract 257 feet from your altitude to get pressure altitude. So this is an easy way. If you're not good at math, like I'm not good at math, you can easily just go right here and then find out what pressure altitude is, right? Obviously, if it's 29902, there's no change in pressure altitude because that's standard pressure, so it's the same. We did the example of 3012 would be 200 feet. So like 3010 right here would be 165 feet lower in the altitude. So let's just stick with the example we did previously. Let's just say the altimeter setting at Gadsden is 3012. So 3012 minus 29902 is 0.2, which equals 200 feet, right? So because it's high pressure, does the air get thicker or thinner, right? High pressure, air gets thicker, so performance increases, altitude decreases, so our pressure altitude would decrease from 569 feet down to 369 feet. So what we're going to do when we go into this chart, we're going to find 369 feet, which is going to be about right there, right? So you got sea level, that's going to be 500, that's going to be 1,000 pressure. So 369 feet is going to be somewhere right in there. Now, it is not uncommon in the summertime to get temperatures 100 degrees in Gadsden, all right? So this is kind of an extreme example, but it's not uncommon. So we're going to see, how is the airplane affected? How is the temperature affected? Or, how does the air, does it get thicker or thinner when temperature, right? We've already talked about if the temperature is higher than standard, so standard's 14 degrees Celsius at 500 feet. It's 15 degrees Celsius at sea level, but again, standard lapse rate here is actually your standard lapse rate right here. So there's your 2 degrees Celsius per 1,000 feet. There it looks like at 4,000 feet pressure altitude, standard temperature is right there. But so there's your standard lapse rate. But if the temperature is higher than standard, that means molecules are spreading apart, You don't want to be close to your significant other, so the air gets thinner, performance decreases, density altitude increases. As the air gets colder than standard temperature, now you want to cuddle with your partner, right? You get cold, so those molecules get closer and closer together, which means the air gets thicker. So if the air gets thicker, performance increases, density altitude will decrease. So let's look at that on this chart right here. So let's do 100 degrees. So there is 100 degrees. We're going to go up to 300, and that looks like it right there. About 369 feet. So there's sea level. There's 1,000. So 500 would be about there. 369 is going to be about right there. And then we're going to follow this all the way over, and that's going to be about 3,200. So there's 3,000, there's 4, there's 35. So that's going to be about 3,200 feet. Holy smokes, right? So we just went from 369 feet when we corrected for pressure. Then when we corrected for temperature, now the airplane thinks it is at 3,200 feet. All right. So we are almost halfway to Denver now. And we started out with a pressure altitude close to Miami. So how is the airplane going to perform? It's going to perform like it is at 3,200 feet, which is not great, right? The air is thin, right? So if you see, density altitude is really what matters, because it's where the airplane thinks it's at. It standardizes the pressure, and it standardizes the temperature, and gives us a number that the airplane is going to perform like it's at 3,200 feet. Okay, if everything was standard, right? So not great. You know, our POH in the Cessna 172 Mike says above 3,000 feet is where we would start leaning the airplane. When lean the airplanes above 3,000 feet, density altitude. So in this case, at Gadsden, 569-foot airport elevation, we would actually have to lean the airplane for takeoff, like those people up in Denver do. It's like, you know, you would never have to think you would lean the airplane for best power takeoff at Gadsden. Like, again, that's something you think you would have to do up in Denver, where it's, 5,000 feet. But in this situation, if it's 100 degrees at Gadsden, the air is as thin as it is at 3,200 feet. So the airplane thinks it's at 3,200 feet. So you would have to lean the airplane for takeoff. Now, again, how would you do that? In the run up, you would hold the brakes, don't let it move, hold the brakes, go full power. You would lean the mixture control until you got a drop in RPM. Then you would go in about 3 or 4 turns, about 2 inches or so. And that should give you roughly, best power. But that's how you would have to lean the airplane. So, conversely, I mean, you could run this chart however you wanted to. If it was 2970, you would add 205 feet right there, because low pressure, the air gets thinner, which means performance decreases, altitude increases. So we would increase that pressure altitude of 205. So that puts us right about, about 769 feet, somewhere right around in there. So, pretty easy. You just go to the chart. If it was 80 degrees, you come up here to about 700, then you come straight across, and boom, the airplane thinks it's at like 2,300 feet or so, something like that. So you can see density altitude is really what matters. Pressure altitude, maximum, you're going to get plus or minus 300-400 feet difference. But with density altitude, I mean, we just went 3,000 feet of difference. So density altitude is really, really what matters. Simple little chart here to determine, density altitude. Again, you can use this for your pressure altitude. Then there's your temperature. You come up, these are your pressure altitude lines. And then you would come over to get your density altitude. Okay. So we talked about what is affected, right, with this density altitude is the engine, because it's normally aspirated, the prop, and lift. Now, if you look here, if we went colder than standard, it actually goes out the chart, because if it was, 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, and we were at a pressure altitude of, 569 feet, it's actually off the chart here, meaning it's below sea level. So, when it's colder than standard, then the air gets thicker, right? We talked about that. You want to get closer, you want to cuddle with your partner, right? So the air gets thicker, which means performance increases, altitude decreases. All right, so it's not uncommon actually. Today, it's in January, it's really cold. It was about 23 degrees outside. Pressure was 3055, and the density altitude was minus or negative 2,500 feet. Kind of crazy, right? So the airplane performed like it was negative 2,500 feet this morning, which means that it performed really, really, really well, right? I mean, it was just screaming, right? And then conversely, if it's 100 degrees, talked about right here, it went, it goes up to 3,200, which the airplane is going to perform like it's at 3,200, which is not as good. So again, what matters? Does the air get thicker? Does the air get thinner? Okay, we've talked that over and over. Okay, so that explains pressure altitude and density altitude. All right, the next types of altitudes. Now, just to explain this is basically, this page shows you how to work that chart in a little more detail. This also shows those relationships, right? As temperature increases, density altitude decreases, or air density decreases, density altitude increases, performance decreases, blah, blah, blah. Everything that we talked about, right? Same thing up here is this little density altitude estimation table, how to calculate takeoff landing performance, all of that. Now, we will be doing takeoff landing performance, weight and balance in the second video. Okay, so types of altitude here. We talked about pressure altitude corrected for non-standard pressure. Standard pressure is 2,902. Density altitude is then pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. When the standard temperature at sea level is 15 degrees Celsius, and that standard lapse rate is 2 degrees Celsius per 1,000 feet. So 1,000 feet, 13 degrees Celsius, and so forth and so forth. Now, I'm going to talk about absolute altitude here. Pretty easy. Absolute altitude is AGL, so that's above the ground level. So that's physically how high you are above the ground. So that's going to vary throughout the flight based upon terrain, right? So it's physically the height you are above the ground. Now, what's given in AGL? We have stuff like cloud ceilings. So when you see a METAR or whatever, that's going to be cloud, your cloud heights are in AGL, so height above the ground. Obstacles, so in a sectional chart, if you're looking at an obstacle, what's in the parentheses is AGL, all right? And I'll show you that in just a minute, so once we get finished with true and indicated here. But absolute altitude is just height above the ground. So you fly your traffic pattern at 1,000 feet AGL, so 1,000 feet absolute altitude. So you just, for piston airplanes anyways, so you would just add 1,000 feet to your airport elevation. So for Gadsden, it's 569 feet. So you would add 1,000. So then that would make this MSL, your indicated altitude, of 1,569 feet. So the next two here are true and indicated. All right. Now, true altitude is your actual height above sea level. Indicated altitude is your approximate height above sea level, okay? So your indicated altitude is your altitude indicated on your altimeter, all right? So that's what you're actually seeing on your altimeter in the airplane, all right? So that indicated altitude, we can change that. We can calibrate that, right, for changes in pressure. So, I think it's the Coleman window is where that we put that pressure in. So if pressure was 3012, like in that example, we just turn that altimeter to 3012, and then boom, we have calibrated that instrument for pressure. But what are the two things that affect the thickness or thinness of the air, right? Is pressure and temperature. Now, do you have something that you can, correct that altimeter for temperature changes as far as higher than standard or lower than standard? Like, no, right? You can only change for pressure. So that's the difference between true and indicated. Is true accounts for pressure and temperature. All right, indicated does not. Right. So the way you can remember this is if you're flying from high to low, look out below. Meaning, if you're flying from an area of a high temperature to an area of a low temperature, then your true altitude is going to be lower than your indicated. So this is your indicated altitude. So this is standard temperature. So at standard temperature, if you're at sea level, it's 15 degrees Celsius. Your true altitude and your indicated altitude is the same. If you get colder than standard temperature, so at sea level, if it was 12 degrees Celsius, your true altitude is actually going to be lower than your indicated altitude. Then conversely, if it's hotter than standard, your true altitude is going to be higher than your indicated altitude. So again, when flying from high temperature to low temperature, look out below, meaning your actual true altitude is lower than your indicated altitude. Now, it's the same thing with pressure. If you're flying from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, then your true altitude is going to be lower than your indicated. However, we can change that altimeter setting, right? So as soon as we change that altimeter setting, the boom, our indicated altitude change and our true altitude and our indicated altitude match when it pertains to pressure. But again, we don't have that ability in our altimeter to change for temperature, right? So when you're flying, again, when you're flying from high to low, look out below. So flying from high temperature or pressure to a lower temperature or pressure, then your true altitude is going to be lower than indicated. But again, pressure shouldn't matter as long as you're resetting the altimeter. But make sure you're resetting the altimeter. So if you're flying from Gadsden, where the altimeter is 3012, and then you go to Rome, Georgia, and the altimeter is 29902, where you're going to be 200 feet because you're flying from high to low, look out below, you would be 200 feet lower than your indicated altitude. But as soon as you turn that altimeter to 29902, then boop, you come right back to indicated altitude, and true altitude will be the same when it pertains to pressure, but not temperature, because again, we don't have a way to calibrate that altimeter, that indicated altitude. We don't have a way to calibrate that altimeter for temperature. Okay, so high to low, look out below. Now, does this matter in VFR conditions, VFR flying? No, not really. How do you keep from hitting obstacles? How do you keep from hitting a mountain? How do you keep from hitting whatever, right? You look out, you see and avoid, collision avoidance and obstacle scanning, right? Where this comes into play is instrument stuff. So you'll see as instrument pilots, we know there's a little snowflake, and what that snowflake means on an instrument approach chart, it'll have a little snowflake and it might have like minus 20 degrees Celsius or something. And so what that means is that if the temperature is minus 20 degrees Celsius or lower, we have to do a temperature conversion chart, because remember, when that temperature is below standard, our true altitude is lower than our indicated altitude. So we can go down to like 200 feet on approaches without seeing anything. So when it gets so cold, then our true altitude gets so low that we could possibly hit obstacles. And so we actually have to add altitude to our minimums to bring up our airplane to account for that drop in true altitude. But again, that's pretty extreme temperatures. All right, temperature really doesn't affect altitude that much. That's the reason why we don't have a way to change. It doesn't affect true altitude versus indicated. That's the reason why we don't have a way to change it in the altimeter. But for our instrument folks, from flying high to low, look out below, that is important when you have that little snowflake. So you've got to add altitude to bring your airplane up, because your true altitude would be a lot lower than your indicated. So it's kind of funny on days like if you had the exact same ceiling at 200 feet, on a hot summer day, you might not see the runway. Might not get in because your true altitude is above your indicated altitude. So you're actually would stay in the clouds. Same day on a colder day, you might actually get in because your true altitude is lower than your indicated altitude. So again, this to me doesn't matter whatsoever for VFR pilots, but for instrument pilots, it does mean a little more. And obviously, it's opposite from flying low to high. Okay, your true altitude will be higher than your indicated altitude if you fly from a low pressure to high pressure, or a low temperature, high temperature. So just remember that. So I did want to show you, let's pull up this here. And I'll kind of show you some indications of true altitude versus absolute altitude. So you kind of see like here's a tower. So this right here would be true altitude. So this is the actual height above sea level. So 1110, what's in parentheses right here would be absolute altitude, so AGL. So it's 290 feet high. it's sitting 1,110 feet true altitude above sea level there. So just wanted to give you that example. Okay, so now we're going to go to the types of airspeeds. All right, and then after this we'll do V speeds, and we're done. So another lengthy video, but it's all good information. So again, 5 types of altitudes: pressure, density, true altitude, indicated altitude, absolute altitude. Hope you got a good understanding of those now. So here we're going to go. We're starting with the types of airspeed. So we start with indicated airspeed. So that's just like indicated altitude. Indicated airspeed is a speed which you actually indicate on your instrument inside the airplane. So it's pretty easy. Indicated airspeed is what you see. Then we go to calibrated airspeed. So calibrated airspeed is instrument error and position error for your specific airplane. Now, the only way to get calibrated airspeed is to go to your AFM or your POH and get that. All right, so that's your built-in instrument errors. You have no way of figuring out what calibrated airspeed is except to go to your POH. So I'm going to do that. If we go here to the website, I'm going to bring up our performance manual. Here we go. And so here is our airspeed correction table for our 172 mic model. So, you see this right here. If we're indicating, so there's indicated, there's calibrated. So if we're indicating 100 miles per hour, our speed is in miles per hour. Then our calibrated airspeed is 99. Okay, so not a big difference. But if you look down here, when we're indicating 40, our calibrated airspeed is like 53. So, like when we're doing stalls in flight lesson number 4, now you should not be looking inside when you do stalls. Eyes all outside. Just stare outside when you're doing stalls. There's nothing to see inside. But, if you do happen to look inside, you can see your airspeed. Basically, what you think is nothing. If you're indicating 40, you're actually going 53 miles per hour through the air. So it's funny when people are like, our stall speed is X, Y, and Z. Well, it's not showing it. It doesn't stall with that on indicator. Well, it's because your instrument has quite a bit of air. So we have like 13 mile per hour difference between indicated and calibrated airspeed at that very slow speeds. But if you see here, as it gets closer to like our landing speed, 70 there is our landing speed, they match pretty well. And they're about dead on the money as it gets higher up. So again, you got to go to your AFM, your POH, go to airspeed correction table to get your calibrated airspeed. This other speed here is equivalent airspeed. We're not going to worry about that. That's talking about a compressibility factor when we get close to the speed of sound. We're not doing that in a 172. So this is only at high speeds and high altitude, not a factor in a 172. So just block that out. And then next is our true airspeed here, okay? So true airspeed is it's density corrected. So it's our actual airspeed. It's our true airspeed through the air. Okay, so we've talked about it a million times, right? What happens to the air as we go up in altitude, right? The air gets thinner and thinner and thinner, right? So the 4 forces of flight is you have thrust, you have lift, you have weight, and you have drag, right? So as we go up in the altitude, the air gets thinner and thinner, right? So if we can keep the same amount of thrust, now that's a big if because we have a normally aspirated engine. So as we go up in altitude, what's happening to our thrust, right? It's decreasing. But let's just say for a turbocharged airplane, we can keep the same amount of thrust going up. Well, what's going to happen to our drag as the air gets thinner? So as we go up in altitude, we're going to have thinner air, so we're going to have less and less drag. So if you can keep the thrust the same, drag decreases, then what's going to happen to the airplane? The 4 forces of flight, thrust and drag. So if your thrust is greater than your drag, you're going to accelerate, right? So true airspeed increases with altitude if your thrust can stay the same, basically, right? Now, in our airplane, now again, go to your performance charts to determine what your true airspeed is based upon your altitude. But like in our 172, thrust actually reduces more than drag as we go up in altitude, which means for us, our true airspeed actually decreases with altitude because thrust decreases more than drag does. Our thrust, because we're a normally aspirated engine, our power decreases more than our drag. But like a turbocharged airplane, your drag decreases more than your thrust, meaning true airspeed, increases. So for example, like in the jet that I fly, we're indicating about like 230 knots up at 45,000 feet. And our true airspeed is like 470 knots, right? So it's a huge difference between indicated and true airspeed. Now that's an extreme example because the air is super thin at 45,000 feet, which means our drag is not much at all. But that's how we can come up with true airspeed. And again, look at your charts. I'm going to pull up the cruise chart here, and I'll show you an example. Again, look at your AFM or your POH, but I'm going to go at 2,500 feet here and 2,500 RPMs. We'd make 72% power. A true airspeed would be 123 miles per hour. Okay, be burning 8 gallons an hour. If we go to 5,000 feet, same power. Now look, we've dropped power, right? 2,500 RPMs at 5,000 feet. Now we're doing 122. Conversely, 25 here, we're dropping even more. So if you can see, same power setting. With altitude, what's happening to our true airspeed? It's going down. Why? Because thrust is reducing more than our drag is reducing. Even though the air does get thinner up there, drag is reducing, our thrust, our engine power is reducing more there. So that is our true airspeed, okay? And then last here is our ground speed. So our ground speed is basically true altitude corrected for the wind. So if you had 0 wind, your true airspeed and ground speed would be the exact same. If you had a 10-knot tailwind, your ground speed would be 10 knots faster than your true airspeed. If you had a 10-knot headwind, then your ground speed would be 10 knots slower than a true airspeed, and so forth, right? So that's the 4 types of airspeed. Indicated, that's what you're seeing on the instrument. Calibrated, remember, go to your POH to get your calibrated airspeed. True airspeed, again, go to your POH, your AFM, to get your true airspeed. But remember, true airspeed does increase with altitude, but it's dependent upon your airplane, right? Go to your AFM. As long as, thrust has to increase more than drag for true airspeed to increase with altitude. Okay. Now the next here is we're going to talk about V speeds. All right. So we're going to talk about V speeds here. So this will be the last thing that we discussed. We talked about the 5 types of altitudes. Talked about basically the 4 types of air speeds, and then we're going to finish up speeds by talking about V speeds right here. So V speeds are calculated at maximum gross weight. All right. So all these speeds are at maximum gross weight. We'll talk about how speed kind of changes the weights in just a second. But we're going to start here with VR. So these speeds are based upon the 172 Mach model, okay? So the VR rotate speed is 65 miles per hour. So that's basically the speed at which we lift off on takeoff there. VX is our best angle of climb. So remember that, X creates angles, all right? So what best angle of a climb does is it gives us the greatest altitude gain over a given distance, all right? So when would we use VX? So that means if we're taking off right here, this is our runway, we have an obstacle right here, then what we want to do is we want to have the greatest altitude gain over a given distance, okay? So that's where we would use that VX, is like for a short field takeoff, all right? So where we have the greatest altitude gain to get over this, 50-foot obstacle at the end of the runway, all right? So X creates angles, best angle of climb. Now, I'm going to show you where we would see that. So if you go to your performance manuals, you can basically get your VX right here on takeoff data. So if you see, there's our weights, and there's that 68 right there. So the speed over a 50-foot obstacle. So if you go to your POH or AFM, it's going to be the speed at your 50-foot obstacle on your takeoff data. So that's what your VX is. And then we're going to come over here. Your VY is your best rate of climb. So this is the greatest altitude gain over a given time. So think rate equals time. VY being your best rate of climb. It's 90 miles per hour for our 172. Again, I'm just going to go right back to that performance manual, which you can get on the website. If you look, here's your rate of climb data, and there's your 90. And it does break down, it does lessen just a little bit as we go up with altitude, but right here, I'm sorry, as we decrease in weight. But there it is at sea level, and it does decrease a little bit with altitude, as you can see here, 5,000 feet and at 10,000 feet. But that's your BY, your best rate of climb. You can get that on your climb chart. So if whatever aircraft you're flying, go to your time and route to climb charts, and whatever speed is there, that's your VY, okay, based upon that. Go back to here, so VSO, this is a stall speed in a landing configuration, so with flaps, and that's 54 miles per hour. I will show you, so in this previous slide here, again, there we go. This previous slide, VSO is on the airspeed indicator, and it's the start of this wide arc. This wide arc is our flap operating range. VSO is right there. So that's the start of your white on your airspeed indicator, okay? So every airspeed indicator will have this white tape, so that's your stall speed with flaps is right there. Let's go back to your V-speeds here. Your VS is the stall speed in the takeoff configuration. So that's without flap. So that's going to be the start of your green line right here. So this green is this normal operating range. So there is your VS, your stall speed without flaps or in a clean configuration. VFE is your maximum flap extension speed. For us, it's 100 miles per hour. That is also given to us on our airspeed indicator, and it is the start of your wide arc here is your maximum flap extension speed. So we can use flaps anywhere in this white arc. We'll continue on. VA here is maneuvering speed. Now this is not shown on our airspeed indicator, but the way I want you to remember maneuvering speed, it gets kind of confusing. So talk with your CFI directly if it doesn't make sense here. But maneuvering speed is basically, I want you to remember, it's the speed in which it will stall before it brakes, okay? For ours, it's 112 miles per hour. Now, what in the world does that mean that it will stall before it brakes? So maneuvering speed is defined as the maximum speed at which you can make a full scale flight control deflection on one axis only. So we talked about operation of systems. We talked about the flight controls. So your primary flight controls are ailerons, rudder, and elevator, and they each control their own axis, right? And so maneuvering speed means that on one axis only, that's the key, not combination of axes, but in one axis only, you can go full scale deflection. So whether it was, you know, the longitudinal axis with the ailerons, or if it's the lateral axis with the elevator, or if it's the vertical axis with the rudder, you could go full scale deflection on one of those flight controls. And if you're at this speed or less, then the airplane is not going to come apart. But this maneuvering speed does not guarantee if you go, you know, maximum aileron and then also rudder at the same time, you know, all bets are off there. But to understand maneuvering speed, it's important to understand it decreases with weight, okay? Here's the definition again: the speed at which full-scale flight control movement on one axis only will not result in structural failure. But if you remember it this way, the speed at which it will stall before it brakes, this will understand what it means by it decreases with weight. So here's how we look at this. Now, again, the four forces of flight, right? Thrust, drag, lift, and weight, okay? So this is calculated at maximum gross weight, all right? But we know as students that the airplane can stall at any given speed, right? And we talk about load factor and whatnot, right? So what happens to our stall speed as weight decreases, right? So as weight decreases, our stall speed decreases, right? Because when the weight decreases, then we don't need as much lift, right? So that means the speed at which the air's got to be going over the wing can lessen because we have less weight, all right? Also, conversely, as weight increases, then our stall speed increases, right? We need more airflow, we need more lift to counteract that weight as it increases. Now, we can increase the weight two ways. We can increase the weight in a 1G by just putting more fuel or bags or people on board, right? But we can also increase the weight with G-forces. So if we bank the airplane 60 degrees and then we hold our altitude, so not only do we bank, but we pull back to hold our altitude, that's something called load factor, right? And at 60 degrees of bank, holding altitude, we've increased the G's by 2. Okay, so we've increased the load factor twice. So our maximum gross weight for our airplane is 2,300 pounds. Now, if we go 60 degrees of bank and hold altitude, that's a lot of bank, right? But we've just increased the weight from 2,300 pounds to 4,600 pounds, right? Because we're pulling 2 G's. So now, do you think lift and weight, right? If we doubled our weight, do we have to increase lift? Yeah, absolutely, right? Our stall speed actually increases 40% at 60 degrees of bank, the speed at which we reach our critical angle of attack. So my point in all of this is that yes, stall speed is it changes with weight. So as weight decreases, the amount of lift we need decreases, so our stall speed decreases. As weight increases, the amount of lift we need has to increase, or our stall speed increases. Again, a stall is basically just when the wing quits producing lift, right? So we need that speed over the wing to increase, and that increases lift to counteract this weight, all right? So that's how we understand that maneuvering speed decreases with weight, because stall speed decreases the weight. So if we want to have it stall before it structurally breaks, then as weight decreases, stall speed decreases. So if stall speed decreases, our maneuvering speed needs to decrease so that it will stall first before it breaks. I hope that makes sense. I know maneuvering speed is so confusing to most students, but it's the speed at which it will stall before it breaks. And the reason why it decreases with weight is because stall speed decreases with weight. And if we want it to stall first, then we have to decrease that maneuvering speed along with the stall speed so that it stalls first before it breaks. And usually this is about 1 mile per hour or so, 2 miles per hour, basically about 1 knot per 100 pounds. It's kind of a give or take. But look in your AFM, the newer model airplanes, they actually give maneuvering speed at different weights. But just remember, it's all based upon your stall speed. So if you know as weight increases, your lift has to increase, so your stall speed increases. As weight decreases, you can decrease the amount of lift to support that weight, so your stall speed would also decrease as your weight decreases. Hope that makes sense. To me, I think the most important thing to know in maneuvering speed is not VA, the maneuvering speed that's given here, but what's something called minimum maneuvering airspeed. And to me, that is the most important thing for a student to understand. Airspeed is life, and have a minimum maneuvering airspeed. So for our students, it's and it's usually best glide for most airplanes. Our best glide down here is 80 miles per hour. But for our students, it's 80 miles per hour. So the absolute most important thing I have my students do is no slower than 80 and no more than 30 degrees of bank. Well, why do I say no more than 30 degrees of bank? Because we know when we increase bank, we're increasing the G's, which means we're increasing weight, right? Which means we increase the stall speed. So if we do no more than 30 degrees of bank, that barely increases stall speed. It's not that much. It's by about 1.1, maybe a 10% or less increase in stall speed. So it's not that much. But no slower than 80, no more than 30 degrees of bank. To me, a minimum maneuvering airspeed means more than this VA, but you do need to understand what VA is, okay? So VA is maneuvering speed, but to me, minimum maneuvering airspeed, which is not anywhere on here, right? That's the most important. And like I said, for most airplanes, that's best glide. So whatever your best glide is, no slower than your best glide, no more than 30 degrees of bank until you're right short final. about a half mile from the runway, wings level, then you slow it down to your landing speeds, and then your landing speeds are always going to be on your landing data. So for us, that's 69. So I tell my students no slower than 80, no more than 30 degrees of bank, and then on short final, we slow it to 69. This is what we want to be at 50 feet over the runway. So at about a half a mile, final or so, we start slowing it to 69 to where we cross the threshold at 69 miles per hour, wings level. It works out beautifully. Okay, so a couple more here and we're finished with this video. VNO is our maximum structural cruising speed. That's the maximum speed in smooth air. It's 145 for us, and that is also on the airspeed indicator. It's this right here. So it's the end of this green arc and the start of the yellow. So we can only be in this yellow arc in smooth air, okay? So any rougher air, we want to be staying in the screen arc. But VNO, you see right there, 145 is the start of this, the end of the green and the start of the yellow. And then your next speed over here is VNE. That's our never exceed speed. That is our red line, and that is also shown here. Right there is our red line. So that's our VNE. You can see it right there. And that's our maximum speed. But again, VNO, that's a weird term, maximum structural cruising speed. You kind of sound like that's a speed you can never go over. It's not really true. You just can't go over it unless you're in smooth air. So this yellow caution ranges in smooth air. And again, that has all to do with load factor, right? So, the faster we go, then those bumps can create a load on the airplane that can cause structural failure there. All right, and then last one here is VG. It's not labeled as VG right here. I might change that, but VG, you'll see, is your best glide speed, and that is 80 miles per hour. So these are all of your V speeds, and I also do want to say, so I'm going to go back to downloads from my students. If you look up right here, the systems and limitations. So for our airplane, you can bring up the systems and limitations, and it basically gives us a breakdown of some of the systems here, the weight limitations, the fuel limitations. Here are all of our V speeds. There's electrical, and then this has to do with the arm and for weight and balance, which is what we're going to be doing in performance and limitations part 2, is where we're going to basically just do weight and balance. We're going to be doing NW craft, which is 91-103 pre-flight actions required. We're going to do performance numbers and all of that in the performance and limitations part 2. Okay, so hope this halfway made sense. Again, what makes the difference is, does the air get thicker? Does the air get thinner? Density altitude is really what matters. It's the altitude corrected for non-standard pressure and non-standard temperature. Again, the 5 types of altitudes: you have pressure, density, indicated, true, and absolute altitude. Remember, the difference between true and indicated is just we can calibrate that indicated altimeter for pressure. We can't for temperature. So when you go from an area of high to a low temperature, your true altitude is going to be lower than your indicated altitude. Then we talked about the different speeds. You have indicated altitude that goes to, indicated airspeed that goes to calibrated airspeed. You find that in your POH. That then goes to true airspeed, which is your airspeed corrected for density altitude, right? If we can make the same amount of power thrust going up, as we go up in altitude, then the drag decreases, which means our thrust will increase. But again, go to your POH like we did, and you can see in our 172, because we're normally aspirated, our true airspeed actually decreases with altitude because our engine performance is decreasing more than the drag is decreasing. And then last would be that ground speed that we talked about, which ground speed just takes into account for wind. So if there was no winds aloft, true airspeed and ground speed are the same. And then last are the V speeds, maximum gross weight. All of these And then, VA, maneuvering speed, again, speed in which it will stall before it brakes. So really understand how stall speed is affected as, lift and weight, right? As weight increases, we need more airflow, we need more lift to support that weight. So our stall speed increases as weight increases, all right? And we can increase that weight two ways. Whether it's just in a 1G level scenario by adding more fuel and weight to it, or we bank the airplane, we're also creating more weight because we're creating G-forces. 6 degrees of bank, it's double the weight. So I know this is a long video, but hope it helps. Please like, comment, subscribe. Let me know if you have any questions on this. Appreciate you the time investing in your own personal education. Performance and limitations part 2 will be focusing in on how to do weight and balance, how to do performance calculations and NW graphs. So stay tuned for more. Thank you.